I suppose we can't talk about advocacy. We can't talk about advocacy. We can't talk about autonomy. We can't talk about autistic autonomy without first considering disability in general in the Irish population. I suppose the most recent census would indicate that the number of disabled people currently identified in the country sits at around 1 in 5 or 22% of the Irish population. That looks like about 1.1 million people in the Irish population being currently identified as disabled. According to kind of global statistics, then we're looking at identification of autistic people, and that sits anywhere between 1 and 1.5% of the global population. I suppose some people are currently suggesting, though, that the rate of identification of autistic people is sat more closely in the 1 in 36 or almost 3% of the global population, with a number of children being identified every single day. So I suppose anything that is being talked about today absolutely looks at ageing in practice for people who are ageing currently in our services. But we also have to be cognizant of the body of people who are coming fast down the tracks and who will also require support. Currently, we're looking at trying to scaffold, and we struggle sometimes to scaffold 1 or 1.5% of the Irish population who are autistic. We really need to get our skates on and figure out how we're going to best support a minimum of 3% of the population in the next short while. I suppose when we talk about autonomy, we have to consider autonomy not just in the older person, but we've got to recognise that it is essential that every autistic person, regardless of their age, that their right to autonomy is absolutely respected. I suppose one of the things that really drives this home is that different people can be autistic and all of the time. People who are autistic aren't just autistic. Oftentimes, as we've heard from many speakers today, oftentimes people have co-occurring conditions like intellectual disability, like ADHD, like dyspraxia, like a physical disability or a hearing or a visual impairment, for example. And it is essential that we start considering the person as a sum of all of their parts and holistically begin to meet their needs, rather than consider their autistic identity as something that we need to meet, or their intellectual disability need as something that we need to meet. We need to start considering the person as a whole person. I suppose, interestingly, in the context of the census, it was very clearly outlining that by comparison to the 2016 census, there has been a significant decline actually in how people present themselves or how people consider themselves from a wellness standpoint. Considerable decline in people who report themselves to be in very good health or even generally of good health. And I suppose in amongst that then we do see that lovely increase, that lovely kind of stepping into a space where people recognise that they're in very good health, and that is actually situated in the age 75 plus cohort. However, I suppose I'd endeavour that I'd ask people actually to ask whether or not that is the case for autistic people. And I suppose Eilish has mentioned earlier, I know that that there's been lots of talk around mortality and life expectancy and so on. And the reality is that many autistic people don't reach the age of 75. Many autistic people, like the life expectancy of autistic people without an intellectual disability is currently about 7%, 7 years younger than a person without a diagnosis of autism. And in our autistic colleagues who have a co-occurring intellectual disability diagnosis, that's doubled and more than doubled currently with people who are autistic and intellectually disabled, oftentimes living almost 15 years less than their non-autistic or non-intellectually disabled counterparts. There's a huge inequity in that to begin with, and actually that is oftentimes situated in the understanding that people are and must be recognised as autonomous human beings that should be and must be afforded the same access and the same rights, and the same kind of respect for dignity that people who are not autistic or otherwise disabled are afforded every single day. I will leave you click that. I'm a left-handed person, lads, so this is why I can't coordinate the mouse. My mouse is a right-handed my mouse is a left-handed mouse. So I suppose when we think about autonomy, when we think about disability rights, we've got to recognise actually that disability rights are situated in legislation. It is the right of disabled people, including those who are autistic, to actually to be seen and to be treated equitably. Some of the legislation pieces that protect our rights as autonomous members of the Irish community are the UNCRPD, so the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a piece of work that we signed in 2007 and that was ratified or signed into law in 2018, and the Disability Act 2005. The UNCRPD is situated globally. The Disability Act 2005 is situated specifically in an Irish context. And in the Disability Act, for example, this is the piece of legislation that ensures that our children have access to assessment, that our adults have access to assessment wherever is possible. This is the piece that ensures and that enshrines that our disabled, our physically disabled members, for example, should and must have access to different physical spaces. So I suppose it's really important, though, that when we think about the NCRPD and when we think about the Disability Act, that we don't stay stuck in the idea that people who are physically disabled are the only people who need to be accommodated, that people who are that are hearing impaired or visually impaired are the only people who need to be accommodated. I recently spoke with some university professors and discussed the DARE programme, so the Disability Access Route Education programme that should ensure equity of access for all of our disabled students. But even in that situation, colleges are openly discussing prioritising those who have physical disabilities, those who have visual disabilities, and those who have hearing disabilities over autistic or otherwise neurodivergent individuals, because it is believed that those who are deaf with a capital D, who are blind with a capital B, or who are physically disabled are underrepresented in our population. The reality is that there shouldn't be an inequity among any disability service, disability access route, access to education, access to service provision. There should be an equity always for every person, disabled or non-disabled. So this is literally just a little bit of I see I'm looking at the screen here. So I suppose when I think about the legislation and when we think about it in autistic context specifically, there are a couple of articles that really spring to mind. The first one is the Article 3, the General Principles article, and in this article it outlines specifically a person's right to be recognised as an autonomous being, the person's inherent right to dignity, the person's inherent right to equal opportunity, not different opportunity, equal opportunity, equitable opportunity, opportunity that is situated in a space of justice. So exceptionally important that we start considering the needs of our autistic colleagues as those that must be facilitated and met. This idea that people who are autistic do not access, that they don't live long enough to access those kind of geriatric services and so on. This isn't okay. This must change. It has to change, and it should already have changed. So I suppose days like today are the days that absolutely are most important in being a catalyst for kind of seeing that change that we want to see as we move forward and in the future. In the context of Article 21, so we know lots of our autistic colleagues are non-speaking. They don't use words to communicate. They instead use gestures, they instead use visuals, they instead use AAC. And I suppose Article 21 outlines the right of a person to express themselves, the freedom of expression. But not only does it outline freedom of expression, it outlines that a person has autonomous choice to use whatever method or means of communication they want in order to ensure that they are expressing as they decide to and as they see fit to. And yet in my work every day, I come across lots of people who don't have means with which to communicate, people who are restrained, people who are prevented from accessing community and so on, because they don't have a means with which to communicate, and they are doing all they can to communicate in the only which way that they know how, which oftentimes looks like that physical or emotional response that we oftentimes pathologize and consider to be somebody just being challenging and just creating kind of difficult moments for ourselves. We need to start flipping the narrative on all of this if we are going to show up and if we're going to ensure equity for our autistic colleagues. Really, really, really important that we do that. I note that there was a number of people, Deirdre, I think, mentioned that lovely person who was supported around accessing their community and continued access to that kind of social connectedness and so on. Article 29 outlines the importance of people accessing their communities and the importance of that kind of participation and being seen as a valued member of your community, of our communities. The reality is that it's such a pleasure to sit in front of people today and to see people with all different, it's such a diverse a group of people. It is so wonderful to see so many different stakeholders situated and involved in the conversation today, rather than just speaking to the people who actually oftentimes present with outside-in perspectives. They're not the experts in a person's experience. The person with lived experience is the person who is expert in that. Nobody else. And I suppose this is the other shift that we need to make if we are going to ensure that there is equity of access in healthcare, in service provision, in our education systems, in whatever system we're thinking about. So I suppose this is just the little piece. This is the research on the life expectancy piece. I think it's been covered already, but I do think it's really important to reinforce, I suppose, and to restate how important it is that not only is it important that autistic people equitably access provision of service, it's exceptionally important that autistic people are afforded the same opportunity to live as long as their non-autistic peers. Really, really important that that message is driven home today, so that we start changing things and we create the opportunity for people to live a dignified and respected life where they as individuals and their experiences are kept front and centre at all times. So how do we change this? How do we add life to years? And how do we put life in years as well? So I suppose there's a couple of things we can do. First and foremost, as I've said already, autonomy. Autonomy is the key, ladies and gentlemen. When you think about autonomy, there's loads and loads of different definitions available. You Google, you do a voice search on Google, and immediately there's a number of different definitions are presented. I suppose ultimately what autonomy means is that somebody is provided the freedom to decide for themselves. Their decision, their ideas, their will and preference, their voice is central to everything that impacts them, that they are involved in, that their life and their life expectations, their quality of life, that everything is driven by them, by their choice. There's a number of people here today who are autistic. There is a number of people here today who are intellectually disabled. The reality is that every person sitting in this audience, disabled or non-disabled, every person's voice matters, and every person's voice has to be brought to the centre if we are going to honour the people who we work with, if we are going to honour their experiences, and if we're going to actually ensure that we're situated in legislation, if we are going to ensure that we are meeting their rights from a legal perspective. Actually, it's the bottom line is that this is written in legislation. This is outlined as a right, as a human right, and as a right as an Irish citizen. So let's start stepping into a space where we absolutely ensure that this is the case. So I suppose quality of life then, guys, quality of life, we're taught, first and foremost, I suppose, to recognise that autonomy is situated, quality of life speaks to autonomy. You can't speak about quality of life unless you speak about, or you can't speak about quality of life unless you are practising autonomy. Autonomy is the foundation upon which quality of life is built. When we think about quality of life, then to circle right back to that bit of a stat on ADHD at the start, we've got to remember that a person is the sum of all of their parts, not just their autism diagnosis or their intellectual disability diagnosis. We've got to remember that if we are going to ensure quality of life for everybody, we meet them where they're at, and we absolutely consider their emotional, their physical, their mental, and their spiritual well-being, and consider all of those areas wholeheartedly and provide a level of equal focus on each and ensure that each of them are deemed as important as the other. If we want to think about meeting somebody where they're at and ensure that they have access to healthcare, we've got to make sure that we are absolutely, as previous presenters discussed, that we're considering people not just through the medical model of disability, not just through the social model of disability, but through that biopsychosocial model of disability. Because remember, even when we think about sensory experiences, autistic people navigate much different sensory systems and much different sensory experiences to the non-autistic population. The reality is that I can't shut my auditory or my hearing sensitivity off just because I'm expected to focus more on a bright light, for example. It's really, really important that we recognise the diverse nature, I suppose the diverse human condition, and recognise a person's individual needs at every single point and holistically meet those needs at every single point. This is one of the ways in which we ensure a person's life expectancy and the years that this is one of the ways that we can ensure that we are adding years to life, that people actually live longer. We meet them where they're at. We don't wait until somebody is 40 plus or 60 plus or 70 plus. We teach our little people, we teach our 3-year-olds and our 4-year-olds and our 5-year-olds how to look after themselves, how to brush their teeth, and make sure that they are equipped with the tools to do so. If it's too difficult, there's so many different, just to call upon the toothbrushing thing, there are so many different toothbrushes. There are things that you can stick on your finger. Lots of our young autistic people like biting on things. They like chewing on things. This is not only a way to scaffold a person in brushing their teeth, it's also a way to support their sensory need. So let's start thinking outside the box to facilitate the needs of our autistic colleagues. Too important, guys. Nobody is any more important than anybody else in this room. Everybody is too important to fail, full stop. So I suppose other things that we can do, we make sure, first of all, that we absolutely scaffold the person and that we meet their needs holistically. We have to do that if we are going to show up for the person. We don't just focus on the person's autistic needs. We don't just we should absolutely, and we must focus on somebody's communication needs, for example, and so on. But we must also consider that ADHD piece or that dyspraxia piece. Like somebody mentioned, a number of people mentioned actually, of people falling, autistic people taking falls and so on. Dyspraxia as a co-occurring condition creates a greater likelihood of somebody falling in the first place. So if we're looking at preventing falls, it isn't the autism piece that we look at first, it is the dyspraxia need that we look at first. If we're going to ensure that we're reducing the idea of frailty, if we're going to ensure that a person is set up for success, we also make sure, I suppose, to reflect. So I hear people, which is wonderful to hear, I hear people talking about reflection, and I hear people talking about reflecting upon people supported experiences and so on. It's really important that we reflect, that we continuously ask ourselves, are we considering this person as a whole person? Are we ensuring and endeavouring to meet the person's needs at all times, their needs holistically? Are we scaffolding them from a mental well-being standpoint, from a physical well-being standpoint, from a sensory well-being standpoint, from a social well-being standpoint, from a spiritual well-being standpoint? If we can answer yes to every single question that we ask ourselves in that manner, then we're doing our job. We're doing nothing more than our job, actually, we're just doing our job. But it is essential that any work that we do with our autistic colleagues is situated first and foremost in that kind of utter insistence upon us always coming from a space of best practice 100% of the time, regardless of bad days that we have. We all have bad days, guys, but it's nobody else's responsibility to carry the weight of the bad day that we are having. It is essential that we show up and we endeavour for best practice at every single moment of the day, in every moment that we spend with our autistic colleagues and our intellectually disabled colleagues, because our colleagues deserve that at a minimum. I suppose access to healthcare. So I know Eilío's done absolutely wonderful work around the healthcare system. I suppose one of the most recent moments of progress in the autistic community around access to autistic healthcare is the SPACE model. So the SPACE model is a model that was outlined and was presented by Dr. Mary Doherty, who is an autistic doctor, by the way, and a number of her colleagues, around ensuring access to healthcare for our autistic colleagues. If you think about autism, people are identified as autistic specifically because they have difficulties in areas of social communication and social interaction and so on and so forth. Autism is considered, it's specifically really an inherent social disability. When we think about accessing healthcare, oftentimes it isn't the fact that somebody isn't feeling pain. Oftentimes it isn't the fact that somebody is having difficulty from an interoceptive or an internal standpoint. It is that there is a huge expectation from a social engagement standpoint. People have to pick up the phone. They've got to ring their GPs. People, if they've got somebody who's ringing for them, they're still expected to answer questions regardless of whether or not they are situationally mute, for example. And there is an expectation all of the time that people show up and engage with healthcare in the way that their non-autistic peers do. The reality is that autistic people have no difficulty with communicating, none whatsoever, when they are communicating with other autistic people. There's a theory called double empathy. Damien Milton, I've no doubt that Orla has been talking about this a million times to everybody that she speaks with. The reality is that piece of research indicates that autistic people have no difficulty with communicating with other autistic people. It is when you've got two different people with two different kinds of brains meeting and expecting to engage that then the difficulties arise. But actually more than that, the difficulties are actually situated in that societal expectation. So if you're a person who expects somebody to look at you when you're talking to them, ask yourself, are you expecting somebody to look at you for your sake or for theirs? I don't have to look at the radio to hear what's being sung, a song that's being played, hear the news that is being spoken about. I don't have to look at it to hear it. It is exceptionally important that there is a respect for the autistic person's style of communication. And actually, when we consider those real fundamental pieces, then we can start looking at removing those barriers to healthcare. The SPACE model, as per Mary Doherty's piece of research, is an exceptional piece of work, and I would absolutely advocate that everybody would look at that. It's situated in autistic experience. There are a number of different autistic stakeholders and collaborators who've contributed to this. So this is where we need to start from. There's no point in people talking about their outside-in views and their perspectives. And look, sure, if they just got into the car, if we just get them into the car, sure, aren't they able to look out the window as they're going along? So look, the person didn't really ask them too many questions. There's no point in bringing that perspective to the table if the person who is being asked is told, is so uncomfortable to begin with that they actually can't articulate, that they can't use words to communicate. Why are we not supporting our autistic colleagues to write something down, to share a visual, to do that, and do that not just with the people who do not use words to communicate, but also do that with people like myself, people like me, who are actually able to articulate at different moments. Everybody has moments where they're feeling completely overwhelmed, absolutely. Remember that autistic people who are very articulate and who are very able to use their words to communicate will lose their ability to communicate using their words in a moment of overwhelm. And when you're feeling unwell, when you've got a pain in your stomach, when you're feeling kind of like you're going to get sick, of course you're not going to be able to articulate that in the way that perhaps your non-autistic colleague expects you to. So I suppose let's start considering and flipping the narrative in that. So, So I'd say there's about 3 slides left. I think it's about 3, if people will bear with me, 3 or 4 maybe, because there's reference slides and all that as well. So I suppose the other fundamental or foundational piece that we have to provide for when we think about our autistic colleagues is a means with which to self-advocate. People who are autistic have to be provided with a way to express themselves, to advocate for themselves, to share their will and preference, to state what they want, to make a choice. If we are going to ensure that we are practicing from a rights-based space, where we are focusing on the person's autonomy, we have to make sure that a person has the tools with which to advocate for themselves. One of the most important things around self-advocacy is a means with which to communicate. We have to ensure that our autistic colleagues have a means with which to communicate. And remember that article that I mentioned earlier, Article 21, I think. Remember that article. We've got to remember that this is written in legislation. It is essential that people have the opportunity to express through their chosen means, not through your chosen means, through their chosen means. It's exceptionally important that we are scaffolding a person as per their will and preference, not as per our will and preference. I suppose the other thing that is really important to take note of is the foundation on which self-advocacy is built. If a person can't outline what they want, then they're not going to be able to self-advocate. If a person can't consent, if they can't articulate or communicate a yes or a no, then they can't consent. So one of the very first things we do as people who support autistic, vulnerable people is we ensure that they have a means with which to say I want, and that they have a means with which to say yes or no. The other thing that we have to recognise is that oftentimes the goal for autistic people is to work toward and become as independent as is possible. Ladies and gents, I don't cut my own hair. I don't fix my own car. I have a mechanic to fix my car, and I have a hairdresser to cut my own hair, because I'm interdependent. I absolutely have spikes and areas in my life where I'm independent, but for the most part I'm quite interdependent. And I suppose this needs to be the gold standard for autistic people as well. Like, there can't be an expectation of interdependence among the general population, and this real focus on absolute independence for the autistic community. Let's create the opportunity for both independence and interdependence, and let's do that by starting the conversation around laying the foundation for self-advocacy. So I suppose to respect autonomy, you guys, you can see the things that I've listed here. I suppose one thing I'm going to ask you guys, because I'm mindful of time or it'll kill me, I suppose one of the things I would ask, so I had a conversation recently with one of the people who support people in Gheel, and the conversation was around gaming, and around one person wanting to game because that was their special interest, and that real focus on movement and exercise and diet and sleep and so on. And absolutely, those things are really, really important. But remember that the autistic person is the person who is expert in their own experience. They're going to know what energizes them, what charges their battery, what replenishes their spoons. They don't need somebody to tell them what else to do. Now, if it is a serious health concern, absolutely, by all means, discuss and educate. It's about education. It's not about insisting. It's about, again, focusing on the choice. I choose to eat a bar of chocolate. I choose to drink a cup of coffee. People here, I have no doubt, choose to have a glass of wine or a pint of beer or whatever the case may be. We all have choice. We know that excessive consumption of alcohol is going to impact our health negatively, and yet some people do that. Yet we are expecting the autistic person in our community to step into a space where they will always make the right decision. Remember that one of the facets of well-being for autistic people is focus and time engaging with their area of special interest. You might not have interest in Pokemon, and you might not understand why the autistic person is engaging with gaming, with playing Pokemon games for 5 days in a row. But the autistic person, absolutely, you can be guaranteed, will gain so much pleasure and so much joy, and so much kind of sustained joy, actually. So I suppose let's make sure that we are honouring the autistic person in the same way that Eilish mentioned earlier. The typical healthcare, like the typical population, speak to different healthcare needs to the autistic and the intellectually disabled community. Let's make sure that we're recognising that those areas of interest and that kind of well-being might look a little bit different for the autistic person, but let's make sure that we're actually stepping into a space where we are ensuring ensuring that we're honouring their voice in that moment. I suppose there are 3 slides left, and at this one I'm going to leave, I think, only to say that it's really important that people have the opportunity for connection as well. Above all else, people have to have the opportunity for connection. We are looking at embracing the person and ensuring that the person isn't connected to people that they don't really like and that they're kind of forced to engage with. I remember being in school and being sat beside the biggest bloody pain in the arse that you'd ever come across. I choose not to surround myself with those kind of people as an adult. Let's ensure that all of our community has the right and is afforded the opportunity to choose who they surround themselves with. I suppose from an allyship standpoint, then I'm mindful that there's lots of people who support people here in the room, and I suppose some of the things that you can do is you can step into a space where you are an ally to the autistic person. So ally, this is the acronym ally. So we acknowledge and we respect the person's choice. First and foremost, we acknowledge their choice, we respect their choice, and we honour their voice. I suppose from a learning standpoint, learning about different disability types, and even in the context of autism, recognising and like understanding that you meet one person with autism, you only meet one person with autism. You work with 10 people who are autistic, you only know those 10 people. Recognising the diverse need and nature of the autistic population and ensuring that you are learning and that you're recognising the importance in learning about the individual sitting in front of you at every step along the way. Thinking about that, leveraging your influence. You go to the movies with the person that you support and you know that they're going to become completely overwhelmed by the really bright light that might be shining in the cinema, for example. Leverage. Make sure that you're creating conversations and creating opportunities to change so that people aren't being exposed to those awful, bright, overwhelming lights. I suppose recognise that you can absolutely speak on behalf of the person with permission and ensure that you're kind of creating change for that person that you're working with. And I suppose from a why standpoint, yield the floor to disabled and otherwise, autistic and otherwise disabled people. The person who is autistic is the expert in their experience. Lived experience, inside out perspective, absolutely, trumps your outside in non-lived experience. So remember that it's essential to yield the floor to autistic and otherwise disabled people. Last slide, ladies and gents, you'll be glad to know. I suppose other ways to protect autonomy, other ways to ensure that a person is recognised from a respect and dignity standpoint is to ensure a person has access to choice, not intermittent choice, sustained and consistent choice, recognising them as an autonomous person at all times, making sure that the person has an opt-out. Let's not force socialisation. Let's not insist that a person engages with somebody else. Let's ensure that a person can actually remove themselves. From an autistic safety standpoint, the premise, the very first thing that we can do to ensure an autistic person's safety is make sure that they've got an escape plan. Let's ensure that the person knows exactly how to get themselves out of a space before we expect them to spend time in it. That is one of the absolute fundamental well-being pieces for an autistic person. Remember, we support participation, we don't ever insist or force participation. And ultimately, if nobody remembers anything else from what I've said today, remember how essential it is to honour the person's voice, the person sitting in front of you at all times. That's it. Sharon, thank you.